So I want you to close your eyes for a second and just, try to imagine a specific soundscape.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, so picture this. It's early morning, midsummer. The sun is like barely even peeking over the horizon yet. The air is totally still. Everything is perfectly quiet.
Very peaceful.
Yeah, exactly. You can maybe hear the faint rustle of leaves or the distant flow of a river. And then, out of nowhere, suddenly, a deafening, chest-rattling roar of artillery fire just completely shatters the silence.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The concussive wave actually rattles the glass in the window panes, and instantly church bells everywhere start clanging frantically, just ringing out to the dawn in this chaotic, completely uncoordinated frenzy.
That is quite the wake-up call.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. If you are a French aristocrat in the early 19th century, waking up to that specific combination of sound, cannons and frantic bells, your first thought is sheer, unadulterated terror.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, your heart would just drop into your stomach.
Right. You're thinking, the barricades are up, the mobs are in the streets, the reign of terror has returned, blood is about to flow, right? But here's the twist. You throw open the window, you're bracing for an absolute nightmare, and you realize it is not a revolution.
It's a party.
Exactly. It is Albany, New York, and the date is July 4th, 1831.
It was just such a brilliantly jarring image, isn't it?
It really is.
You had these men who are, carrying this profound trauma of French history in their very bones, suddenly thrust into the loudest, most explosive celebration of freedom on earth. I mean, the sensory overload alone must have been staggering.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because this isn't just a funny story about some startled travelers waking up on the wrong side of the bed.
Right.
Our mission for this deep dive is to explore exactly what the famous French thinker Alexis de Tocqueville and his traveling companion Gustave de Beaumont, what they actually discovered about the American character by watching ordinary citizens celebrate Independence Day.
It's a fascinating case study.
It is. But I'm struggling with something right off the bat, though. Tocqueville comes from a culture where the rhetoric of quote-unquote equality literally meant dragging the rich and the educated to the guillotine.
Yes, very literally.
So how does he observe an armed, explosive, massive crowd of Americans and not immediately panic that a mob is taking over? Like, how does he make sense of a society that is this noisy, this messy, but somehow deeply unified?
That is the perfect question to guide us today, honestly. And getting to the bottom of that psychological puzzle is exactly what we're going to do.
Awesome.
To explore this, we're using a truly remarkable piece of audio history. We're diving into Episode 3 of the classic NBC radio dramatization, Democracy in America, specifically the episode titled 4th of July in Albany, 1831.
And it's not just a dry reading of his journal, right?
Not at all. It's this incredible, immersive audio time capsule. It drops you right into Tocqueville's shoes on that July morning, letting us hear the cannons, the conversations, and, the culture shock exactly as he and Beaumont experienced it. It really allows us to observe the mechanics of early American democracy in real time.
And man, what a morning to be dropped into. But before we can understand what they are seeing in America, we really need to understand the baggage, this heavy, dark, generational baggage that Tocqueville and Beaumont are lugging across the Atlantic.
Oh, the baggage is immense.
Right, because when those cannons go off at dawn, Beaumont literally remarks that the sound makes him dream of the Reign of Terror. And Tocqueville points out gently that the Reign of Terror was over years before Beaumont was even born. But the trauma is deeply generational, isn't it? Like, it's not just history to them, it's family history.
It is entirely generational, and it is intimately personal. I mean, to understand their mindset, we have to define what the Reign of Terror actually was for you.
Yeah, let's set the stage there.
Following the initial French Revolution in 1789, the political situation radicalized incredibly quickly. By 1793 and 1794, you have a period where the revolutionary government, led by figures like Robespierre, instituted a policy of mass executions to purge, quote, enemies of the revolution.
And we're not talking about a handful of people here.
No, we are talking about tens of thousands of people guillotined, often with barely a mock trial. And for Beaumont specifically, his own father and mother were imprisoned and just barely escaped that fate.
Wow, just barely.
Yes, but his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and uncle and aunt, they were all lost to the guillotine.
That is horrific.
So you have to understand that for these two young men in 1831, words like democracy, the people, and equality, They were not abstract political theories or inspiring ideals.
Right.
They were the mechanical gears of a machine that had systematically slaughtered their families.
The words themselves are literal triggers for them.
Exactly.
And there's this memory Beaumont shares right as they are waking up in Albany that it gave me chills.
The scene in the chateau.
Yeah. He talks about being a kid at his family chateau back in France. It's evening, the servants have been sent away so no one will eavesdrop, and his whole family is gathered around the hearth.
Very secretive.
Extremely. And his mother starts singing a royalist song from an opera, a song that evokes the memory of the executed King Louis XVI. And every single person in that room starts weeping. I mean, sobbing.
What is crucial to analyze here is why they were weeping. Because Beaumont observes that they weren't weeping over their own private misfortunes.
Even though they had lost everything.
Right, even though every single one of them had suffered terribly, losing wealth, status, loved ones. They weren't even weeping primarily over the relatives they had lost on the scaffold. They were weeping over the fate of the king, who had been dead for 15 years.
That's the part that's so hard to wrap my head around.
Well, many of the younger people crying in that room had never even laid eyes on him. But as Beaumont notes, these were the ladies and gentlemen of France. And this man had been the king of France. It's a profound illustration of completely different psychological worldview.
Yeah, I want to push on that worldview for a second because it's just so alien to a modern listener. Like, we tend to think of a king as just a politician with a really fancy hat.
Right, the head of state.
Exactly. But to them, the monarch wasn't just a guy in charge. He was the literal physical embodiment of the nation, right? The collapse of the monarchy wasn't just a change in government. It was the collapse of the universe's natural order.
Precisely. In the traditional European aristocratic worldview, society is viewed as a great chain of being.
A great chain of being.
Yes, it is a rigid, divinely ordained hierarchy. The king is at the absolute top, answering directly to God, and everyone else cascades down from there in perfectly ordered ranks.
So everybody has their specific place.
Yes. And when you sever the head of the king, you aren't just removing a leader, you are shattering the architectural foundation of reality itself.
Wow.
The weeping in that chateau wasn't just grief. It was profound, existential vertigo. They were mourning the death of order itself.
Which makes total sense when you look at the timeline of what they actually lived through. I mean, it wasn't just one revolution and then things settled down. It was endless whiplash.
Exactly. Let's trace the whiplash they experienced, just to give you a sense of it. You have the 1789 revolution, which spirals into the 1793 Reign of Terror.
Right.
Then you have the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who turns the chaotic republic into a militaristic empire, conquering Europe until his final defeat in 1815. Then comes the Bourbon Restoration.
Okay, let's define the Bourbon Restoration for the listener, because honestly, that sounds like a fancy cocktail to me, but it's actually a very specific paranoid era of history.
It does sound like a drink. But no, the Bourbon Restoration is the period from 1814 to 1830 when the brothers of the executed King Louis XVI were placed back on the throne by the victorious European powers after they finally defeated Napoleon.
So they just tried to put things back the way they were.
Essentially, yes. It was a bizarre, incredibly fragile time. The returning aristocrats tried to pretend the previous 25 years of revolution and empire just hadn't happened. They tried to cram the genie back into the bottle.
Which never works.
Never. The society was riddled with paranoia. You had royalists, Republicans, and Bonapartists all plotting against each other constantly. And then, just 1 year before Tocqueville and Beaumont sailed to America, the bottle shatters again with the July Revolution of 1830.
Right. So Charles X is overthrown and they bring in Louis Philippe. And Beaumont refers to him in the audio with such disdain, talking about him and his, quote, damn umbrella.
Yes.
Why the umbrella? That seems like such a weird detail to get mad about.
Well, the umbrella was a symbol of Louis Philippe's attempt to brand himself as the citizen king.
Oh, I see.
Instead of wearing a crown and carrying a scepter, he would walk around Paris in a simple business suit, carrying an umbrella, trying to look like a regular middle-class banker.
Trying to be relatable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But to traditional aristocrats like Tocqueville and Beaumont, this was vulgar and completely absurd.
Right.
It was a monarchy stripped of its divine majesty, a cynical compromise that satisfied absolutely no one.
So they're leaving a France that is perpetually unstable, perpetually oscillating between anarchy and authoritarianism.
That's exactly the environment they flee.
Which brings us back to that hotel room in Albany. Tocqueville comes to America because he sees that the aristocratic order of Europe is dead, the tide of equality is rising globally. He wants to know why, in America, the principle of equality hasn't led to a guillotine being set up in the town square.
He is actively looking for the secret to their stability.
Yeah, and he sees the church bells ringing, people full of zeal, all to celebrate a revolution, but Beaumont quickly corrects him. Beaumont says, in America, the only revolution was a glorious one. So glorious, in fact, that it was not even a revolution, it was a war of independence.
And that's semantic distinction right there between a revolution and a war of independence. That is the philosophical key to everything Tocqueville is about to witness.
It really is.
But before they can even get into the deep philosophy of it, they have to get dressed and go downstairs. And what happens next at the breakfast table is an incredible crash course in the practical reality of American equality.
It really is pure culture shock comedy. So they shake off their loony memories of the guillotine, they go downstairs, and they're just trying to have a quiet early breakfast of cold beef.
A very simple morning.
And suddenly they are interrupted. The lieutenant governor of the state of New York, Edward P. Livingston, and another local official, Mr. Flagg, just stroll right into the dining room.
They just walk right in, no fanfare, no guards, no elaborate announcements.
They just walk up and say, hey, we want you guys to march at the head of our procession today. Now, Tocqueville and Beaumont are deeply honored, of course.
Naturally.
But their immediate instinct, which is so deeply ingrained from European court life, is absolute panic over protocol. They look at these high-ranking government officials and ask, in all seriousness, will not such a thing sadly disturb your table of precedence?
And the Americans just burst out laughing at them. They say, table of precedence, not here. Plague takes such a thing.
Right. So explain to the listener what a table of precedence actually looked like in a European context, because we really don't have a modern equivalent for how rigid this was.
Well, to understand the table of precedence, you have to imagine a society where your physical proximity to power is, codified by law, down to the millimeter.
Like literally how close you can stand to the king.
Exactly. In a place like the Palace of Versailles, this table dictated exactly who was allowed to sit on a chair with arms, who had to sit on a chair without arms, who had to sit on a stool, and who had to stand in the presence of the king.
Wow, so they're terrified of sitting in the wrong chair.
It's a huge deal. It dictated the exact order you walk through a door, or who had the supreme honor of handing the king his shirt in the morning. It was this dizzying, cutthroat system based purely on bloodline and royal favor. If a duke walked into a dining room, everyone of lower rank had to adjust their physical behavior immediately.
So when Tocqueville, an aristocrat, is asked to march at the front of a parade in New York, his brain is immediately calculating like, wait, if I walk in front of the local magistrate, will I offend him? If I walk behind the mayor but in front of the judge, is that going to start a diplomatic incident?
Precisely. He is terrified of triggering a major social crisis. But the American officials explain that the closest thing they have to a table of precedence is a casual meeting they had the night before.
Right, at the tavern.
Yeah, they say that half a dozen leading citizens sat down in a tavern and just thrashed it all out over where the wagons would go, who would ride the horses, and who would march where.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. It's the total, almost aggressive lack of aristocratic pretense. You have the highest officials in the state of New York organizing a major statewide celebration by just hanging out with some neighbors the night before and winging it.
It's completely informal.
Yeah, there's no grand marshal dictating from on high. It's decentralized, ad hoc planning. But just as the Frenchmen are relaxing into this casual vibe, the Americans drop a bombshell. They casually mention that they need to go make sure the militia is going to turn out on time to maintain order in the streets.
And instantly, the tension returns. The Frenchmen tense up. You can practically hear the anxiety in their voices as they ask, militia, what is that?
Right. Beaumont says, we have an army and an armed police force, but we have no such thing as a citizen army. There have been occasions when the army has ruthlessly suppressed the citizens. Now, I have to challenge this a bit, because I'm confused. Doesn't the United States have an army at this point? They just fought the War of 1812 a few decades prior. Why is a militia so shocking?
It's an excellent point of clarification, actually. The United States did have a small professional standing army, primarily stationed out on the frontier or in coastal forts.
Okay.
But the day-to-day maintenance of order in the towns and cities was not conducted by a professional, state-controlled armed police force or the federal army. It was conducted by the militia, meaning the ordinary citizens themselves, who were required to keep a musket and turn out when the community needed them.
Oh, I see.
So what shocks the Frenchmen is not the existence of men with guns. It is the fact that the men with guns are the ordinary citizens. not a separate caste of enforcers loyal only to the government.
The American official awkwardly replies to Beaumont's fear of the army suppressing citizens by saying, happily in the past, in the past. But for the Frenchmen, it isn't the past. It's literally the story of their entire lives. The army is the thing that shoots the citizens when the citizens complain.
Let's look at the mechanics of state power here, because this is where Tocqueville's genius really starts firing. In Europe, the military and the police were tools of the sovereign, used to enforce the sovereign's will upon the people from the top down.
Right, they were a weapon of the state.
The people and the military power were separate, often antagonistic entities. If the people got unruly, you sent in the army to crack heads. But in America, the radical idea codified in the Constitution is that the citizens themselves retain the military power.
Which is wild to them.
The fact that the militia is turning out on a holiday, just for show, completely short-circuits the Frenchman's understanding of how a society prevents anarchy.
Right, because if the citizens are the ones with the guns, who stops the citizens from rioting? And the American answer is, well, the citizens do. They govern themselves.
Exactly. It shows a profound foundational trust in ordinary people to take ownership of their own community's order. It means the military is a participatory civic institution, not a looming threat of suppression. The very people marching in the parade are the same people who would be called upon to stop a riot. You aren't being governed by an external force, you are governing yourself.
Which is an incredibly abstract philosophical concept to try and digest over cold beef at breakfast.
Yes, quite a heavy breakfast topic.
But they don't have to just think about it abstractly, because when they finally finish breakfast and step outside to join the parade, they see this decentralized, self-governing society built right in front of them out of wood and canvas. The floats themselves are like a masterclass in what early 19th century Americans value.
The scene in the streets is so vibrant. As we follow them into the bright sunlight, the source material focuses heavily on the sheer variety of associations organizing the parade. But they spend significant time specifically focusing on the float organized by the local printers, the Typographical Society of Albany.
I love this part. They walk up to this wagon, and mounted at the very front of it is a giant gilt bust of Benjamin Franklin. Now, Tocqueville, being a highly educated European, recognizes Franklin immediately.
Of course. Franklin was a massive celebrity in France during the American Revolution. He was the toast of Paris.
Right. So Tocqueville naturally assumes Franklin is being honored as a great diplomat or a profound philosopher. He asks the master printer standing by the wagon, while recognizing that Franklin was a great man, why do you choose to carry his bust on the printer's wagon?
And the printer's answer provides the absolute essence of American democratic culture in 1831. He looks at Tocqueville and says, because he was a printer himself, that's why. In this country, men can rise to greatness and still be proud of their old trades.
That statement completely flips the aristocratic script, doesn't it? Because in Europe, if you rose to greatness, the very first thing you did was try to aggressively erase any evidence that you or your ancestors ever worked with their hands.
Absolutely. The European social ladder was built entirely on the avoidance of manual labor. If a merchant or a tradesman amassed enough wealth, their immediate goal was to buy a country estate, perhaps purchase a minor noble title, and distance themselves entirely from the smell of the workshop or the ink of the printing press.
You had to hide your calluses.
Exactly. To be a gentleman explicitly meant you did not have to work for a living. Labor was associated with the peasantry, with the lower classes. To flaunt your past as a manual laborer would be social suicide in a Parisian salon.
But here in Albany, the labor is the entire point of pride. The printer is saying, yeah, Franklin negotiated treaties with kings, but he also knew how to set type, and that's why he's our guy.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
It really made me think about how this cultural DNA still exists today. Think about modern politics or business. You have a tech billionaire giving a major keynote address, and they intentionally wear a faded t-shirt and jeans.
Oh, the Silicon Valley uniform.
Right. They're signaling to the crowd, hey, I might be worth $10 billion, but I'm still a maker. I still write code. I'm an engineer at heart. Or a politician who runs for president and makes absolutely sure every voter knows they used to work a blue-collar summer job or they grew up on a farm. In America, proximity to ordinary calloused hands work is a badge of authenticity and honor, not a mark of lower status.
And if we look at the socioeconomic structure of early 19th century America, we can see why this was the case. Unlike Europe, America didn't have a centuries-old entrenched aristocracy that monopolized all the land. They had a vast open frontier.
Right, land was abundant.
And labor was scarce and highly valued. Therefore, labor equated to upward mobility. The parade they're watching isn't led by military generals on horseback or hereditary nobles in carriages. It's led by the Mechanics' Benefit Society, the Painters' Association, the Apprentices' Society. The tradesmen, the people who actually build and maintain the physical world, they are the vanguard of the Republic.
And speaking of vanguard, there's another detail on that printer's float that catches Tocqueville's eye. Alongside the United States colors, the printers are flying the flags of France, Belgium, and Poland.
Yes, the international flags.
Now, the French flag makes sense. They had the alliance during the Revolutionary War, Lafayette, all of that. Belgium had just had its own revolution in 1830, establishing its independence. But Poland? Why is a random printer in upstate New York flying the flag of Poland in 1831?
The printer notes to Tocqueville that there is a keen interest here in Polish independence. This is a fascinating historical footnote. In 1830 and 1831, the November Uprising was occurring in Poland. It was an armed rebellion against the oppressive rule of the Russian Empire.
Okay, so a contemporary event.
Yes. What's incredible is how dialed in the average American citizen was to this conflict. News traveled very slowly across the Atlantic, but when it arrived, Americans devoured it. They held rallies, raised funds, and felt a profound, empathetic connection to the Polish cause.
Which tells us so much about America's self-image at the time. They didn't just view themselves as a lucky, isolated success story sitting comfortably behind an ocean. They viewed themselves as the pioneers of a global movement.
They saw themselves as the vanguard of liberty.
Exactly. They believed they had lit a torch of freedom that was eventually going to illuminate the entire world. They felt an absolute kinship with any nation, anywhere, fighting to throw off a monarch or an empire.
It is a deeply ingrained ideological solidarity. However, the printer then turns to Tocqueville and tries to comfort him. Seeing that Tocqueville is French, the printer says, "No call for you to fret a friend. France has overthrown her tyrants, have she not?" He assumes Tocqueville must be thrilled that France is following the American blueprint.
But Tocqueville immediately pushes back, right?
Wow.
This is where his analytical mind kicks in. He says, very politely but firmly, "I do not think that the American Revolution and the French Revolution are truly comparable."
Yes, he rejects the comparison entirely.
Because the American printer thinks a revolution is a universally glorious thing, Tocqueville is deeply, deeply skeptical of this American tendency to equate their stable, successful republic with France's chaotic, bloody overthrow of the entire social order.
And his skepticism is entirely justified by the mechanics of what actually happened in both countries. To the Americans in Albany, a revolution meant declaring independence, fighting some battles, and then going back to your farm or your printing press to vote for your local mayor.
A practical change in management.
Exactly. To Tocqueville, a revolution meant the utter destruction of the social fabric. As he walks past the different trade associations in the parade, he is internally comparing the outcomes. He notes that the American Revolution produced a George Washington, not a Napoleon Bonaparte.
Right, no dictator.
The American Revolution had no reign of terror.
Yeah.
Washington was followed by an orderly succession of constitutional presidents: Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, not by counter-revolutions, military coups, and plots within plots.
Which brings up the million-dollar question. I mean, this is the core of his whole journey. Why? Why did the American experiment stabilize and flourish when the French experiment fractured so violently and repeatedly?
That is the essential question of democracy in America.
Well, as we continue to follow them through the crowd, Tocqueville finds a massive piece of that puzzle. And he didn't need to read a complex political treatise to find it. He just needed to talk to an old man sitting in a carriage near the front of the procession.
This encounter is perhaps the most poignant and revealing moment of the entire morning. They meet a veteran of the Revolutionary War.
Let's set the stage for how rare and significant this is. It is 1831. The Declaration of Independence was signed 55 years prior.
So this man is quite old.
Very old. This man is a living, breathing relic of the founding era. He is the physical embodiment of the history they are celebrating.
Yes. Tocqueville approaches the carriage. He's very polite, utilizing all his European manners, and he says, "It is an honor, sir, to meet a survivor of the armies of the American Revolution."
And the old man immediately, almost grumpily, cuts him off. He barks back, "No such thing. It wasn't a revolution. That's what the British called it. We called it by its right name. War of Independence."
Now, at first glance, that might just sound like a grumpy old man arguing over semantics. But that semantic distinction is the foundational core of Tocqueville's entire political philosophy regarding America.
Let's unpack that.
Let's look at the mechanics of those two words. A revolution, in the French sense, implies revolving completely, turning the entire social, economic, religious, and political order entirely upside down.
Like a total reset.
Exactly. When the French revolted, they didn't just get rid of the king. They eradicated the aristocracy. They changed the names of the months on the calendar. They instituted a new decimal time system. They closed the Catholic churches and tried to invent a new cult of the supreme being. They attempted to start history over at year zero.
They completely demolished the house down to the bedrock because they wanted to build a completely different structure. They wanted a utopia.
Precisely. It was a utopian totalizing project. But a war of independence is fundamentally different. The American colonists weren't trying to overthrow the social order of their hometowns in Massachusetts or Virginia.
They already liked their towns.
They already had their local colonial legislatures. They had their mayors, their town councils, their churches, their well-established property rights, and common law. They were fighting simply to sever a political tie with a distant parliament in London that was encroaching on their pre-existing inherited liberties.
So they weren't fighting to invent a new world from scratch. They were fighting to protect the world they were already living in. They were defending an existing local order, not creating one out of thin air.
Exactly. And because they weren't trying to enforce a new utopian vision on everyone, they didn't need a reign of terror to purge the non-believers. The veteran's personal story really grounds this philosophical difference in harsh reality.
Yeah, he tells Tocqueville about being a drummer boy during the retreat across New Jersey, and he paints a really vivid picture of it. He talks about how cold and sick and miserable the men were in December of 1776. They were freezing, starving, and, just losing.
It was a very dark time for the Continental Army.
He even mentions that General Washington was writing dismal letters, acknowledging how desperate the situation was. But then the veteran brings up Thomas Paine. He says Washington paraded the regiments in the freezing cold, and instead of giving them rations or gunpowder, which he didn't have, he had Paine's words read out loud to them. These are the times that try men's souls.
Notice how Tocqueville interprets this story, though. His European frame of reference immediately kicks in. Tocqueville says, no doubt he was trying to put heart into you. You have heard of our great General Napoleon. He was always addressing his troops to put heart into them.
He's trying to make it make sense.
He's trying to map his understanding of history onto the American experience.
Yeah.
He's trying to understand George Washington through the lens of Napoleon Bonaparte.
But the veteran isn't having it. He immediately shoots down the comparison. He acknowledges that Napoleon was a great general, but points out that, Napoleon got beat in the end.
A very American pragmatism there.
Very much so. He also points out that Washington was practical. He knew armies don't run on inspiring speeches alone. But then the veteran delivers what I think is the most important line of the entire exchange. He calls Washington the greatest man the world has ever produced. Why? Not because he won battles, but because he served only 2 terms as president, and then he went home to Mount Vernon and lived as a private gentleman.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of democratic stability, this is the absolute linchpin, the voluntary relinquishment of supreme power. Let's compare the mechanics of the 2 generals Tocqueville is thinking about.
Let's do it.
Napoleon used his brilliant military victories to seize political control, crown himself emperor of the French, conquer vast swaths of Europe, and eventually die in exile after ruining his country through endless war. George Washington used his military victories to secure independence, grudgingly served as a civilian leader when called upon, and then, when he was at the absolute height of his popularity and could have easily made himself a king or a dictator for life, he just willingly gave up power and took a carriage back to his farm.
To a European mind in the 19th century, a victorious general walking away from ultimate power was almost incomprehensible. It was basically unheard of since the days of Cincinnatus in ancient Rome. That established the precedent for the peaceful transfer of power, which is the singular defining characteristic that separates a stable democracy from a fragile one.
It proves that the system is greater than any individual man. Washington's refusal to become a monarch ensured that the War of Independence didn't just birth another tyranny.
It's so profound, but I also have to highlight the sheer humor in this scene, because the audio play makes this veteran so wonderfully, complexly human. Here is a guy who survived the freezing, brutal retreat across New Jersey, one of the most harrowing military campaigns in American history, and he is absolutely terrified and annoyed by the 4th of July fireworks.
Yes. As they are talking, A firecracker goes off nearby, and he starts complaining bitterly about the noise.
He says, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but he basically says, I'd rather be back in a retreat across New Jersey than listen to those infernal contraptions.
He really hates them.
He's complaining about local politicians firing muskets from their porches, rockets whizzing into second-story bedrooms, and these things he calls blazing grasshoppers jumping at you on the sidewalk. He grumbles, when we fit the war, we never reckoned that for the rest of our lives, every living soul from the senator to the chimney sweep would let off his patriotism in gunpowder.
It's fantastic.
It's just so funny and so relatable. It shows that the incredibly loud, slightly dangerous, chaotic nature of the 4th of July has literally been around since the very beginning.
It grounds the history beautifully. It reminds us that these were real people with quirks and complaints, not just flawless marble statues. And Tocqueville reflects on this as the parade begins to move forward again. He looks at the veteran sitting there, holding his torn regimental flag, completely riddled with bullet holes.
Such a striking image.
And Tocqueville thinks to himself, addressing the American people in his mind, you have no idea what it's like to overthrow a tyranny. He realizes a profound difference in how the two cultures treat their veterans.
Oh, so?
Well, in America, these old soldiers of the Revolution are universally viewed as precious, uniting relics of a shared triumph. In France, because the regimes change so violently and so often, a veteran of the Republic might be viewed as a threat by the empire, and a veteran of the empire was viewed with suspicion by the restored monarchy. Veterans were often dangerous reminders of the opposing faction, rather than unifying symbols.
Wow. So the parade marches on through the streets of Albany. They pass the crowds, the floats, the marching bands, and they eventually make their way into a large Methodist church for the formal indoor exercises.
Yes, the civic ceremonies.
And this brings us to a scene that I think is the emotional core of the entire day. It really reveals the psychological scaffolding of the nation. It shows us what serves as America's true civic religion.
Yes, the public reading of the Declaration of Independence. As we follow them into the church, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. The noise of the parade, the fireworks, the shouting, it all just drops away. Tocqueville observes a profound, almost electric silence settling over the packed room.
The judge steps up to the pulpit, unfurls the document, and begins to read. When, in the course of human events, and we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The entire congregation is hanging on every single word.
They are completely captivated.
And as the judge reads the long list of specific grievances against King George III, Tocqueville actually hears a low murmur of indignation and genuine anger ripple through the crowd.
Tocqueville notes specifically in his observations that this was not a theatrical performance. It wasn't a rote, empty ritual. He writes, there was, in the reading of these promises of independence so well kept, in this return of an entire people towards the memories of its birth, in this union of the present generation to that which is no longer something deeply felt and truly great.
He describes it as an electric current that made the hearts of the crowd vibrate. What a vivid description. But why is this so structurally important? I mean, they know they're independent. Why do they need to sit in silence and listen to a 55-year-old document?
Because we have to ask ourselves, in the absence of a monarch, to bind the nation together with a shared subjecthood, and in the absence of a state-mandated religion to enforce a shared morality, what holds a massive, diverse democracy of equal citizens together?
What stops them from fracturing?
Exactly. What prevents them from just fracturing into tribal factions? The answer is a shared devotion to a founding text and a shared memory of a founding sacrifice. The public reading of the Declaration acts as a civic mechanism to bind the generations together. It's a moment of profound reverence where the citizens recommit themselves to the underlying chord progression of their society.
It's the sacred text of the American civic religion. But this is America. So immediately after this incredibly sublime, goosebump-inducing moment of profound unity, we get the absolutely ridiculous.
We certainly do. The transition from the sublime to the absurd is jarring, even for a seasoned observer like Tocqueville.
After the reading, they introduced the, quote, silver-tongued 4th of July orator, a local lawyer named John B. Van Schaik. And this guy steps up to the pulpit, clears his throat, and immediately says, consider, first of all, ancient Egypt.
Starting from the very beginning.
Literally. And he proceeds to give this incredibly long-winded, pompous speech where he apparently reviews the entire history of the universe, Greece, Rome, the Dark Ages, just to prove that the United States, and probably Albany in particular, is the ultimate center and pinnacle of human civilization.
Tocqueville is incredibly annoyed by this. He doesn't find it charming at all. He calls it a rhetorical harangue, and complains that the order's flow of words and stupid national pride had succeeded in destroying a part of the profound impression that the rest of the spectacle had made on me. He sees it as vulgar boosterism.
I couldn't help but laugh out loud at this because it is such a universal, timeless experience. It's exactly like going to a modern corporate retreat or a political convention.
Oh, entirely.
You have this beautifully produced, genuinely moving video or mission statement that reminds everyone why they are there. You feel this incredible surge of unity and purpose, and then some mid-level executive in a suit gets up with a terrible 60-slide PowerPoint presentation and talks for an hour and totally kills the vibe. It perfectly encapsulates the duality of the American experiment.
It really does highlight that duality. On one hand, you have this deeply reverent, almost sacred devotion to the theoretical ideals of equality and liberty represented by the Declaration. On the other hand, you have this bombastic, highly commercialized, self-congratulatory pride represented by the orator.
The messy reality.
Tocqueville is witnessing the messy, practical reality of a society where anyone has the freedom of speech. And the inherent trade-off of free speech is that you frequently have to endure listening to people who absolutely love the sound of their own voice.
And the cherry on top of this whole church scene, the moment that really seals the surreal nature of the day, is the music at the end. After the terrible speech finally concludes, the proceedings are supposed to end with an ode to the progress of liberty.
A fitting end.
But the hosts of the event have decided to set the lyrics of this ode to a very specific piece of music. They set it to the tune of the French Marseillaise.
And not only that, they don't have a grand symphony to play it. The musical accompaniment consists entirely of an orchestra of one single flute.
A single flute. Playing the Marseillaise in a Methodist church. Tocqueville says it's a profound day of contrast for him. He saw and heard America all day, but in that moment, he thought only of France. He finds it deeply, darkly ironic that his specific French trauma, because the Marseillaise is the song that represents the bloodiest, most terrifying days of the French Revolution for his family, intersects with American triumph in this peculiar, almost comical way.
It's a brilliant accidental distillation of the cultural disconnect between the two nations. Let's look at the mechanics of why that is so ironic. To the Americans in Albany, the Marseillaise just represents liberty and revolution. A generalized romantic concept they wholeheartedly support. They strip it of its historical baggage.
They just think it's a catchy tune about freedom.
But to the Frenchman, it means the guillotine. It means the mob. But the fact that this terrifying anthem of blood and terror is rendered so harmlessly, so innocently, on a single flute in a peaceful church, underscores the completely different trajectories of the two nations. In France, the song fueled mass executions. In America, it's just a nice tune to wrap up a civic meeting before everyone heads to the tavern.
Which is exactly where they head next. The formal ceremonies end, the old veteran has survived the artillery fire, the single flute has been put away, and the day moves into its final, highly anticipated phase.
The banquet.
And as often happens on a holiday, the alcohol begins to flow. They head to a grand banquet. This leads to a tradition that, for Tocqueville, crystallizes exactly how this chaotic, noisy democracy actually manages to hold itself together without tearing itself apart on a daily basis.
Yes, the day concludes with the tradition of the toasts. As the dinner kicks off and the drinks are poured, they begin with the formal, symbolic 13 toasts representing the original 13 colonies. There are toasts to George Washington, to the memory of Lafayette, to the Constitution.
Very traditional.
And humorously, the 13th toast is traditionally dedicated to the fair sex, who are, as the Toastmaster says, always entitled to our protection.
So far, so standard. It's formal and polite. But then come the voluntary toasts. This is where the floor is opened up, and any man can stand up, raise a glass, and propose a toast to whatever political sentiment or candidate he wants.
And this is the part that completely fascinates and initially alarms Tocqueville.
Why?
Because what he observed is men standing up and proposing directly opposed political sentiments in rapid succession. The political climate of the 1830s was incredibly heated. We had Jacksonians, anti-Jacksonians, debates over tariffs, the national bank, states' rights.
A lot of tension.
And yet, one man stands up and loudly toasts a particular partisan policy. The crowd cheers, they drink. Immediately, another man stands up and toasts the exact opposite policy, eventually insulting the previous toast. And everyone cheers, clinks glasses, and drinks again.
Beaumont actually explains this phenomenon to Tocqueville. He leans over and says, that was simply because, on Independence Day, all shades of political opinion unite in praising the Union. Now, I want to pause here. I need you to explain the mechanics of this tolerance.
Sure.
How does a shared ritual override deep tribalism? Because if you tried to do this in Europe at the time, it wouldn't end with a clinked glass. It would end in a duel or an arrest.
Exactly. This is perhaps the most vital sociological lesson of the entire deep dive. Think about the political culture Tocqueville and Beaumont left behind in France. In a system built on revolutionary and counter-revolutionary purges, ideological purity is quite literally a matter of life and death.
Right, there is no loyal opposition.
The state demands total adherence to the current regime's philosophy. If you were at a banquet in Paris during the Reign of Terror or during the Bourbon Restoration and you express a political opinion vehemently opposed to the ruling party, you don't get a polite toast in response. You get a trial. You get exiled. You lose your property or you lose your head. The French system required absolute rigid alignment from the top down.
So the French wanted a society that functioned like a classical orchestra. It's perfectly conducted from the top down by a single maestro. Everyone has rigid sheet music they must follow exactly. If one person plays a wrong note, it ruins the entire symphony, and that person is immediately kicked out of the orchestra, or worse. It requires absolute purity to sound good.
That is a phenomenal analogy. I love that. The French model was the classical orchestra, demanding flawless, synchronized obedience.
But the Americans, sitting at this banquet table, were essentially playing jazz. Everyone is improvising. It's loud. It's a bit noisy. Sometimes the instruments clash with each other. But they tolerate the friction because everyone is still playing over the exact same underlying chord progression.
The Constitution.
Exactly. That chord progression is the Constitution and the shared memory of their independence. As long as you agree on the basic framework of the Union, you can improvise your politics however you want.
The mechanism of tolerance here is that their ultimate highest loyalty is not to a specific faction, a specific politician, or a specific ideology. Their highest loyalty is to the framework of the Union itself. The system is intentionally designed to absorb disagreement. It acts as a shock absorber for human passion.
It bends so it doesn't break.
As Beaumont notes during the dinner, European ceremonies might have more brilliance, more grandeur, and better music. But the American ceremonies have more truth. They reflect the actual, unvarnished, messy reality of the citizens' lives and beliefs. They aren't putting on a fake show of total unity. They're demonstrating how to remain united despite their deep differences.
It's the difference between a meticulously choreographed military parade in an authoritarian state, which looks pristine on the surface but is incredibly brittle, and a slightly disorganized parade of tradesmen in a free republic, which looks messy but is structurally resilient.
Precisely. The authoritarian system shatters under pressure. The democratic system flexes and absorbs it. And this observation brings Tocqueville to his massive, overarching conclusion. As the day winds down, he is trying to compose his thoughts after all this sensory and intellectual stimulation. He's observing what he calls the sacred day of the nation of equality.
And what does he conclude?
He realizes that what he has seen in Albany isn't just a quirky, isolated anomaly of American culture. It's the literal blueprint for the future of the entire world.
I want to read his exact quote from his reflections on this because it is so incredibly powerful and prophetic. He writes, "The nations of our time cannot prevent the conditions of men from becoming equal, but it depends upon themselves whether the principle of equality is to lead them to servitude or freedom, to knowledge or barbarism."
That's a staggering, monumental realization for an aristocrat to make in 1831. He is fully accepting that the old world is dead. The aristocratic order, the great chain of being, cannot be resurrected. Equality, the dismantling of hereditary privilege, is an unstoppable force that is coming for every nation on earth. But his brilliant insight is that equality is merely a condition. It is not a final destination.
Right. It's a vehicle, but it doesn't guarantee where you're going to end up.
Exactly. You can have the equality of a free citizenry actively governing themselves, which he saw in the local officials planning a parade, the mechanics proudly displaying their trades, and the citizens calmly debating at a banquet. That leads to freedom and knowledge. Or you can have the equality of subjects suffering uniformly under an all-powerful tyrant, which he saw in the bloody aftermath of the French Revolution, where everyone was equally terrified of the state. That leads to servitude and barbarism. The choice rests entirely on the culture and the habits of the people themselves.
So what does this all mean for us? I mean, this connects so deeply to themes we often celebrate on this network, particularly the ideas championed by G.K. Chesterton. Think about what we've seen in Albany today through this incredible audio journey. We've seen a deep, vital importance placed on tradition and ritual, the reading of the Declaration, the reverence for the torn, bullet-riddled flags.
Absolutely.
We've seen a profound, grounding gratitude for the sacrifices of the past, embodied in the respect given to the drummer boy who froze in New Jersey so that future generations could have the luxury of complaining about loud fireworks.
And most importantly, from a Chestertonian perspective, we see the profound realization that it is ordinary people who sustain a free society. It's the printers, the mechanics, the local lawyers giving bad speeches, the militia volunteers. It is not distant monarchs or untouchable centralized bureaucracies or elite philosophers in salons who keep the machinery of democracy running.
It's the regular folks.
It is the local, boisterous, sometimes pompous, but genuinely dedicated citizens taking ownership of their own backyards.
Tocqueville crossed an ocean looking for the secret to American democracy, and he didn't find it in Washington, D.C., or in a dense political manifesto. He found it in a Methodist church listening to a single flute, and at a banquet table where political rivals clinked glasses.
Which leaves us with a truly vital, provocative thought to mull over. Tocqueville's ultimate lesson is that democracy is not a natural state of rest. It isn't a perpetual motion machine that just runs endlessly in the background once the founders set it up.
It takes work.
It requires active daily maintenance. It is a muscle that will atrophy if it isn't exercised. And it is exercised through these civic rituals, like reading the founding documents aloud, honoring the veterans, engaging in local governance, and gathering as a community to break bread despite our fierce political disagreements. These rituals are the mechanisms that bind one generation to the next.
So true.
So ask yourself, in our modern era, an era deeply defined by information overload, digital isolation, and intense tribal polarization, what are the civic rituals that still give you that electric current of shared humanity? What are the active habits you practice that bind us together rather than driving us apart?
That is a fantastic, challenging question to leave off on. Democracy is an active habit. We want to warmly remind you that this deep dive was based on an absolutely incredible piece of audio history. You really should experience the whole thing for yourself. The soundscape and the voice acting bring these profound ideas to life in a way that just reading a book cannot.
It is highly recommended listening for anyone who wants to understand the roots of the American character.
You can listen to the complete 14-part radio series of Democracy in America in the Chesterton Radio playlist. You can find it at democracyinamerica.chestertonradio.com. Once again, that is democracyinamerica.chestertonradio.com. This deep dive proved that the 4th of July is about far more than just a summer holiday with hot dogs, parades, and fireworks. It is fundamentally about the values, the local institutions, and the shared active memories that sustain a free society against the historical tide of tyranny. Keep questioning, keep learning, keep exercising those civic muscles, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.